The courtroom looked perfect. The benches were straight, the floors were scrubbed white, and 3 identical portraits of the judge stared down from the wall. But the moment Cassie Thornton sat at the clerk's desk, her hand found a worn oval groove in the oak, carved deep by someone who had sat in that same chair, day after day, gripping the wood like a man too terrified to let go. Her father had sat right there, 9 years ago, and he never came home. Now Cassie has a pen, a federal ledger, and 2 days to prove that a dead man is still alive, and that the judge who erased him is still on the bench. Stay right here, because this story will remind you that the most permanent thing in any courtroom isn't the gavel, it's the ink. If it moves you, hit like, drop a comment, share it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
Pale Fork looked right. That was the exact trouble with it. Cassie Thornton stopped at the threshold of the county courtroom, her hand resting on the heavy pine frame, and let her eyes do the work. The oak floorboards were scrubbed clean with lye water, pale and dry. The benches for the gallery sat perfectly straight. On the back wall, 3 identical oil portraits of Judge Thaddeus Vance stared down at the empty room. Not 1 portrait, not 2, 3. She didn't move her feet. A town that took that much care to make its justice look spotless was usually hiding a corpse under the floorboards. Cassie set her heavy leather traveling bag down beside the clerk's desk. Her right hand moved by habit, fingers brushing against the charcoal gray linen of her skirt, seeking the ink callus on her middle finger. It was thick, hard, and permanent. The mark of a woman who recorded everything and belonged nowhere. Then she saw the desk. On the left corner of the dark oak, top, right where a clerk would anchor their left hand. While writing with the right, there was a worn indentation. It was a smooth, deep oval, stained a darker hue by years of human oil and sweat. Pale Fork didn't have a permanent clerk. The county was too poor, too small. They relied on the circuit travelers like her who came in for a week, logged the cases, and moved on. A traveler doesn't stay long enough to wear down a piece of oak. Someone had sat in this chair, day after day, anchoring themselves against the same spot, terrified to let go. She didn't touch the groove. She simply looked at it, logging it into the ledger of her mind, the place reserved for things that didn't fit the official story. "You were early, Miss Thornton." The voice was like oil on gravel, slow, smooth. Judge Thaddeus Vance stepped through the side door behind the bench. At 58, he looked exactly like his portraits, though the gray in his beard was sharper in the morning light. His black frock coat was brushed clean of trail dust. He didn't offer a hand right away. He assessed her weight first. Not her physical weight, but the gravity of her presence. "The stagecoach doesn't wait for court schedules, Judge," Cassie said. Her voice was short, clipped, stripped of the polite fluff most women in the East use to fill the air. Vance walked down from the raised dais, his boots clicking evenly on the scrubbed pine. He stopped 3 feet away and smiled. It was a politician's smile, perfectly measured to give the impression of warmth without spending any real heat. "Your father, Arthur Thornton, was a circuit clerk in these parts once," Vance said, his eyes tracking her face for the slightest tremor. "A highly cautious man." Cassie's hand tightened imperceptibly on her pen case. Cautious. Not brilliant. Not honest. Cautious. "He was thorough," Cassie replied. "Thoroughness is a luxury the frontier cannot always afford," Vance said, turning slightly to look at the empty benches. "Out here, law is a fragile thing, Miss Thornton. We are 12 days' ride from the federal district court. If a man steals cattle or breaches a fence, we cannot wait for a circuit judge from Austin to tell us what is fair. We make our own order. My decision might look abrupt to an Eastern eye, but they keep the peace. That is the true spirit of the law, the survival of the community." He turned back to her, his smile broadening. I expect you to keep that in mind while you re-logging my court. The official record needs to reflect the necessity of our peace, not just the cold mechanics of a textbook. Cassie looked from Vance to the portraits, then down to her ledger. The law isn't a tool for what a judge thinks is necessary, Your Honor, she said, her voice dropping an octave, perfectly flat. The Federal Judiciary Act is very clear on that point. A court reporter's duty isn't to protect the community or smooth over your decisions. My pen belongs to the state, and the state demands a verbatim record. If a man screams before you hang him, I write down the scream. If you break a procedure to speed up a verdict, I write down the breach. When a record is altered to fit a necessity, the basic civil rights of the accused are destroyed. The paper must remain honest, even if the room is not. Vance's smile didn't vanish, but it froze. The warmth left it, leaving only teeth. An admirable sentiment, he murmured. Let's see if your ink holds up to the heat of a West Texas courtroom. He turned and walked back to his chambers, his boots clicking with that same terrifying regularity. Cassie waited until the door clicked shut. She walked over to the desk, pulled out her personal journal, the small, unlined book she kept for herself, and wrote a single line. Vance knew him, not by name, by threat. A shadow blocked the morning light from the hallway door. Cassie didn't jump. She looked up slowly. The man standing in the entry was tall, his frame cut from old cedar and leather. His salt and pepper hair was tucked beneath a sweat-stained Stetson. On his vest sat a silver badge, the star in a circle, of a United States Marshal. It wasn't polished to a mirror shine, but it wasn't tarnished either. It looked like it had been rubbed clean with an old flannel shirt by a man who didn't want it to draw attention, but couldn't let it go dark. He didn't take off his hat. He didn't say good morning. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the room, checking the corners, mapping the exits, before they finally settled on her. Marshal Coltman, Cassie said. Reading the name etched into his federal credentials on the desk file, the lawman stepped into the room. He walked with a slight hitch in his right hip, the slow, rolling gait of a who had spent 30 years in a saddle. He stopped by the railing that separated the gallery from the court. Cassandra Thornton, he said. It wasn't a question. But when he pronounced the name Thornton, his jaw locked. A tiny pulse beat once in his temple. It was a 2-second hesitation, the exact duration of a lie, or a sudden spike of fear. Cassie's fingers twitched toward her pen. You're late, Marshal, she said. The border doesn't have a clock, Reed Coltman replied. His voice was a low, dry rumble, like water moving over gravel, deep underground. He didn't look at her face anymore. He looked down at her hands, noting the ink callus. Vance been in here? Reed asked. He was. What'd he tell you? He told me he makes his own order. Reed let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if there was any humor in it. He walked over to the clerk's desk, his boots making a heavier, duller thud than the judge's. He didn't look at Cassie. He looked straight at the worn oval groove in the dark oak wood. He reached out. His left thumb hovered over the indentation for a second. Then he dropped it. His thumb fit into the worn wood perfectly. It was an exact match. Reed pulled his hand back quickly, jamming it into his coat pocket as if he'd been burned. Don't go digging in the basement, Miss Thornton, Reed said, his back still turned to her. Pale Fork has a way of burying things deep. Keep your head down. Write what he tells you to write. I write what is spoken, Marshal, Cassie said, her voice sharpening. That's my federal mandate. I don't take editing from judges, and I don't take it from lawmen who are too tired to do their jobs. Reed turned around slowly. His eyes were old, gray, and flat as slate. Out here, the silent cowboy said. his voice dropping so low she had to lean forward to catch it. The law isn't what's written on your paper, girl. The law is who's left standing to read it. He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked out into the dusty street, his heavy steps fading into the whistle of the West Texas wind. Cassie sat down in the chair. The wood was cold beneath her. She reached out her right hand, her index finger tracing the rim of that worn oval groove. She didn't fit it. The mark belonged to a larger hand, a man's hand. 9 years ago, her father had sat in this exact chair. He had carved that silence into the wood with his own weight. She opened her official ledger to page 1. The paper was clean, white, and empty. She dipped her quill into the inkwell, the black liquid glistening in the harsh morning light. The trial hadn't even begun, but the room was already shouting. The heat came at noon. It didn't slip into the room. It dropped through the cedar shingles like molten lead. Cassie Thornton sat, with her spine pressed hard against the straight back of the oak chair. Her right hand was a machine. Dip, right, slide. The scratch of her steel nib against the heavy rag paper was the only steady sound left in the county courthouse. 40 men packed the gallery benches behind her. They smelled of stale sweat, unwashed denim, and horses. Nobody spoke. On the elevated bench, Judge Thaddeus Vance leaned forward. His black sleeves were rolled up 2 turns, exposing thick, hairy forearms. "State your name for the record," Vance said. The man in the cedar witness box didn't look at the judge. He looked at the floorboards between his boots. "Silas Beckett," the man said. Silas was 34, but the Texas sun had carved 60 years into the skin around his eyes. His flannel shirt was clean, but the cuffs were frayed down to the white threads. Someone had scrubbed that shirt for him before the trial. A wife, a sister, someone who still believed a clean collar could stop a hemp rope. "And your occupation, Mr. Beckett?" the prosecutor asked. His name was Harmon Dwyer. He had a voice like a legal brief, read aloud by a preacher, high, nasal, and perfectly convinced of its own righteousness. He paced the narrow strip of floor between the gallery rail and the bench, his leather boots squeaking with every step. "I am a hand," Silas said. His voice was too quiet for a room full of Texas cattlemen. "I pull calves. I fix wire. I did 6 months of that for Samuel Hogue before he died." Cassius' pen never stopped. "I pull calves. I fix wire. I did 6 months of that." Stopped. His jaw didn't tighten. It dropped slightly. His eyes slid across the floor, past Dwyer's polished boots, and hit the bench. He looked at Vance. Cassie didn't look up from her paper, but her left hand shifted. She counted the seconds in the rhythm of her breath. 1, 2, 3. She dipped her pen in the margin of the official record. She didn't write words. She noted the break. Silence. 3 seconds. Then she noted the gaze. Defendant looks to judge. Alters posture. "Let's talk about the night of August 14th, Dwyer said, stopping his squeaking boots right in front of the witness box. "The night Mr. Hogue was found with his neck broken at the bottom of the north paddock fence. You were seen there, Silas, not 300 yards from the body, by 2 independent witnesses." Silas swallowed. You could hear the dry click of his throat from 5 feet away. "I was at the number 2 barn," Silas said. "Doing what?" "Fixing a mare's hock. She'd torn it on some loose barb." "A mare," Dwyer said, his voice dripping with theatrical doubt. "At midnight, without a lantern." "I had a candle stub," Silas said, "and you heard nothing. No shout, no sound of a struggle from the house?" Silas started his answer fast. "Hogue was a man who didn't." He froze the sentence, hung in the hot air like a horsefly. Silas' eyes snapped to the judge again. Not a glance. A plea. He stayed like that, his mouth half open, for 2 full beats of Cassie's heart. Then he looked down at his own knuckles. He wasn't a bad employer, Silas finished. His voice had lost its gravel. It was thin now. Paper. Thin. Cassie logged it. Defendant interrupts own statement. Looks to bench. Judge Vance didn't blink. He reached down, picked up his horn-rimmed spectacles, and began wiping them with a silk handkerchief. The witness has answered, Vance said, his voice smooth as grease. He heard nothing. Proceed, Mr. Dwyer. Nothing further, Dwyer said, turning his back on the prisoner. Vance banged a small wooden gavel once. Court is recessed until 2 o'clock. The prisoner will be returned to the cells. Miss Thornton, ensure those pages are blotting cleanly. I want no smudges on the state's record. Cassie didn't answer. She sat still until the room cleared. The 40 men in the gallery filed out slow, their spurs clinking against the pine floor like iron crickets. Marshal Reed Coltman stayed until the last man was through the double doors. He didn't look at Cassie. He just stood by the exit, his hand resting on the iron latch, a silent wall of leather and wool. Then he slipped out, closing the door behind him. The courthouse was dead then, just the heat and the smell of old ink. Cassie gathered her loose pages, slipped them into her leather portfolio, and walked out the rear door. The back steps led down to a small patch of shade beneath a withered chinnaberry tree. The ground was white limestone dust, dry enough to choke a lizard. She sat on the bottom step, pulled a piece of cold cornbread from her pocket, and opened her personal journal. She didn't eat, she wrote. Silas Beckett is lying, not to save his life. To save something else. Vance is holding the leash. He didn't do it, you know. The voice came from behind the trunk of the chinnaberry. Cassie didn't drop her book. She closed it slow, her thumb keeping the page, and looked up. A girl stepped out of the gray shade. She was 14, maybe 15, with a face that looked like it had been scrubbed, with the same lye soap as the courtroom floor. Her hair was 2 different lengths, tied back with a piece of greasy rawhide. She wore an old canvas smock that must have belonged to a grown man. The sleeves rolled up past her elbows in thick, clumsy bundles. Under her left arm, she carried a book. The leather was split down the spine, the corners chewed away by mice. Cassie recognized the gold lettering on the front. Elements of Law and Equity, 1856. You shouldn't be back here, child, Cassie said. My name is Maeve Logan, the girl said. She didn't look at Cassie's face. She looked at the ink callus on Cassie's hand. And I ain't a child. I read 3 chapters of Blackstone before my brother burnt the oil. Maeve sat down on the dirt, 3 feet from the steps. She didn't ask permission. She just dropped her heavy book into the limestone dust between her shins. Silas Beckett didn't kill Old Man Hogue, Maeve said. She picked up a dry chinnaberry twig and began snapping it into neat half-inch pieces. I was out past the north paddock that night. My grandmother needed some wild horehound for her chest. I saw Hogue. He had a jug of corn liquor in his hand, and he was trying to mount that big red gelding from the fence rail. He missed the stirrup, fell clean over the backside of the horse, and hit the stone sleeper at the bottom of the post. His neck went crack like this twig. Maeve snapped the wood. Cassie watched the girl's fingers. They were steady. Did you tell the marshal? Told the judge, Maeve said, looking up. Her eyes were blue, clear, and completely devoid of fear. Walked right into his office the next morning. He sat there behind that big cedar desk, smoking a cigar that smelled like dead leaves. He listened to me. Then he reached into his drawer, pulled out a nickel, and shoved it across the wood. What did he say? He said I was a good girl, but I had a wild head, Maeve said. He told me the sun makes people see things that ain't there. Then he said if I told my brother or the neighbors, he'd have the county surveyor recheck the lines on our south 5 acres. My grandmother S. house sits on those 5 acres. We don't have the deed paper. Lost it in the fire back in '71. Maeve threw the broken twigs into the dust. He didn't ask me what I saw. He told me what I didn't see. That ain't law, is it? Cassie looked down at her portfolio. The rag paper inside felt heavy, like lead sheets on her knees. No, Maeve, Cassie said. She spoke slow, letting her words hit the rhythm of the wind through the dry leaves above them. That isn't law. That's extortion. The law is a system designed to protect the individual from the weight of the state. Under the Constitution, Silas Beckett has a right to a fair trial, and that means every piece of exculpatory evidence, every fact that might clear his name, must be heard by a jury of his peers. When a judge uses his office to threaten a witness, he isn't just breaking his oath. He is committing a felony against the civil rights of every person in this county. He is making the law an instrument of violence. Maeve nodded once. She didn't look surprised. My grandmother told me never to go near that building, she said 9 years ago. There was another man who sat at that desk, a man with spectacles who wrote real fast. She said he went out for a walk one night and just kept walking until he hit the sky. She told me that desk has a curse on it. Cassie's heart didn't stop, but the cornbread in her pocket felt like stone. What was his name, Maeve? The man from 9 years ago. Don't know, Maeve said, standing up and pulling her heavy book back under her arm. Grandmother just calls him the clerk. She said he was a quiet man, like you. Didn't talk to the big men in town. Just talked to the folks who brought him vegetables or needed a letter read. The girl turned toward the alleyway behind the courthouse. The afternoon session's starting soon. Miss Thornton, you better get back inside. The judge don't like it when the ink dries before he has finished speaking. Cassie watched the canvas smock disappear around the corner of the gray stone wall. She stood up. Her legs were stiff from the stagecoach ride, but the coldness in her blood had nothing to do with the trail. She walked back up the rear steps, her boots loud in the empty hall. She entered the courtroom from the back. The air was hotter now, thick with the smell of old wood and impending rain. She walked to the clerk's desk, sat down, and placed her portfolio on the blotter. She looked down at the smooth, oval indentation on the left side of the desk. She didn't put her hand in it. She just looked at the way. The light from the high window caught the dark, grease-stained grain. He sat here, she thought. He sat right here, and he heard something he wasn't supposed to write down. The side door creaked open. Judge Vance walked in, his black coat swaying like a shroud. He didn't look at her. He mounted the steps to his bench, took his seat, and picked up his gavel. "Bring in the prisoner," Vance said. Cassie opened her official ledger to a fresh page. Her hand was steady, but her mind was already miles away, digging through the dark earth of a Texas grave that had been left open for 9 long years. The moon didn't help. It was a silver crescent, thin as a thumbnail, hanging low over the limestone ridge. Cassie Thornton walked down the courthouse corridor with her boots in her left hand. The pine floorboards were cold against her wool stockings. She didn't carry a lantern. A lantern meant oil, and oil meant a smell that traveled through an empty building faster than a dog. She used her right hand to feel the wall rough plaster, cold stone, then the smooth cedar frame of the archive door. The door wasn't locked. In Pale Fork, they didn't lock the records because nobody here knew how to read them, except the judge and the circuit riders. She slipped inside and closed the heavy oak door until the latch clicked. The air in the archive room was dead. It smelled of old glue, vinegar, and sheepskin ledger bindings. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small wax candle stub, and struck a lucifer match against the sole of her stocking. The small yellow flame flared once, casting long, monstrous shadows. Across the floor, the room was lined with unpainted pine shelves. Bundles of legal documents were tied together with hairy hemp twine, each bundle covered in a thick, even layer of gray dust. Cassie walked past the 1876 box, past the 1874 box. She stopped at the bottom shelf in the corner. The box was labeled County Personnel and Ledger Logs, 1870-1873. She knelt in the dust, her skirt bunched around her shins. She set the candle stub on a flat stone on the floor and pulled the wooden box out from the shelf. It was heavy. The seat sides split at the corners. She lifted the lid. The dust on the top sheet was different. It had small, round tracks in it, the marks of a field mouse that had died 3 winters ago. She lifted the bundles out, one by one, until she reached the bottom of the box. There it was, a thin, leather-bound volume with a marbled paper cover. The binding was blue calfskin, worn white at the hinges. She opened the book to September 1872. The handwriting on the first page was thick, round, and ugly, the script of a local clerk who had been paid in corn liquor and land script. Cassie's eyes flew down the column of names until she hit the entry for September 14th. Circuit Clerk A. Thornton. Arrived Sept 14, 1872. Departed Sept 28, 1872. Voluntary. Cassie held the candle closer. The wax began to drip onto her thumb, hot and biting, but she didn't move. She stared at the word voluntary. Beneath it was a signature, Arthur Thornton. It looked right at first glance. The capital A had the long, elegant crossbar Heedy learned in Philadelphia. The T had the sharp, precise serif. But Cassie didn't look at the letters. She looked at the pressure. Her father was a man who wrote with a light, and he used an English steel nib that required a delicate touch, leaving the upward strokes thin as spider silk. This signature was heavy. The steel had dug into the paper, leaving a small, ragged trench at the bottom of the H. Someone had drawn his name. They had sat at that desk with a sample of his script, their hands shaking with the effort of imitation, and they had forced the metal through the rag fibers. It was a forgery, a clumsy, frightened forgery. He didn't sign it, she whispered to the empty room. She didn't cry. She closed the volume, laid it back in the dust, and reached for the adjacent box. Criminal Determinations, Fall Term, 1872. This bundle was thicker, tied with 3 separate knots of rotting hemp. Cassie used her embroidery scissors to snip twine. The papers inside were brittle, yellowed at the margins by the Texas heat. There was only one major trial in September of that year. The state of Texas versus John Doe, vagrant. Charge: murder of an unnamed cattle driver on the Pecos Trail. Thaddeus Vance, presiding judge. Arthur Thornton, recorder. Cassie turned the pages. The script here was beautiful. It was her father's genuine hand, the thin upward strokes, the neat, regular margins, the tiny, perfect numbers at the top of each leaf. She read the testimony. It was a standard trail hand dispute over a card game until she reached page 4. The drifter, John Doe, was on the stand. The prosecutor had asked him where he got the gold eagles found in his boot. The drifter's answer was written in clear, unfaltering ink. The gold came from the judge's own desk. He told me if I put 2 balls into the teamster's back before the wagon hit the county line, the south title would be clear for the survey. The man who ordered the layout was... The paper ended. The bottom half of page 4 was gone. It hadn't been torn by age or rotted by water. It had been cut with a razor along a straight steel-ruled line. The next 3 pages, the pages that should have contained the name and the verdict, were completely missing. The ledger skipped directly to October 3rd, written in the thick, round, ugly script of the local clerk. Cassie sat on the stone floor. Her candle stub was burning down to the grease, the flame flickering as the wick drowned in its own tallow. Her father hadn't left Pale Fork because he was tired or because he wanted to go home. He had recorded the name of the man who bought a murder. He had written it down because that was his job, because the law demanded a verbatim account of every word spoken before the bench. And for doing that job, he had been taken. "The paper doesn't lie, Miss Thornton." The voice came from the dark doorway. Cassie didn't jump. She blew out the candle stub with one sharp puff of air, plunging the room into absolute blackness. She slipped her embroidery scissors into her sleeve and stood up against the wall, her breath shallow. "I can hear your stays creaking," the voice said. It was Marshal Reed Coltman. A click sounded in the dark, and then the yellow flare of a lantern filled the room. Reed stood in the doorway, his hat in his left hand, his right hand resting loose on his belt. He looked at the snipped twine on the floor. He looked at the yellowed papers on her lap. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "You shouldn't be here," Reed said. "My father was here," Cassie said, her voice cutting through the smell of old paper like a knife. She stood up, letting the documents slide onto the cedar box. "He sat in that courtroom and he wrote down the truth. And you let them take him." Reed stepped into the room, his heavy boots loud on the bare floorboards. He stopped 2 feet away, the lantern light throwing long dark hollows under his cheekbones. "I was 32 years old," Reed said. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the wall behind her. "I'd been a deputy for 6 months. I thought the badge made me part of something big. Something that came out of Washington and had the weight of the whole country behind it." Then Arthur came to my boarding house room. He had those 3 pages in his pocket. He was shaking so hard he couldn't keep his spectacles on his nose. Reed let out a slow, ragged breath. "He told me Vance had hired the drifter to clear the title on the Maxwell grant, 4,000 acres of the best grass in the county. He wanted me to take the pages and ride for the federal marshal in Fort Worth," he said. "If he kept them on him, he'd be dead before the stagecoach arrived." "And you didn't go?" Cassie said. "I told him to wait," Reed said. His voice dropped lower, stripping away the professional distance he'd kept since she arrived. "I told him we needed to be smart. I told him if I left town on a horse at midnight, Vance's regulators would catch me before I hit the river. I told him to hide the papers under the desk blotter and let the session end normal. I said we'd go together on Saturday." He looked down at his own boots. Saturday never came for him. Thursday night, 2 men walked into his room. I heard the horses from my porch. I didn't get off my chair, Cassie. I sat there with my hand on my iron, and I watched the dust rise in the moonlight down the road. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. "You waited 9 years, Cassie said. "I did," Reed said. He looked up, his gray eyes old and steady in the lantern light. "And that's why I'm telling you to put those papers back in the box and walk out of here." Vance isn't just a judge, Cassie. Under the Texas County Organization Act of 1876, a magistrate has total executive authority over local law enforcement in the absence of a federal circuit court. Out here, he is the county. He appoints the deputies. He controls the land registry. If you try to accuse him with a torn piece of paper and a forged signature, he won't just destroy the record, he'll destroy you. And your father's name will be buried under 5 feet of limestone with the rest of the secrets in this town. Cassie reached down and picked up the ledger from 1872. She held it against her ribs, her fingers pressing into the blue calfskin. Binding. The law isn't a weapon for the men who hold the benches, Marshal, Cassie said, her voice rhythmic, hard, and clear. The federal enforcement acts give your office the power to override local authority when there is evidence of institutional conspiracy against the civil rights of a federal officer. My father was a circuit clerk, an employee of the federal judicial system. His forced disappearance is a federal crime. If you won't use your badge to enforce that higher law, then you aren't a lawman at all. Just a watchman for the cemetery. Reed didn't move for a long time. The lantern oil sizzled in the brass wick tube. Then he reached out his left hand, the one that didn't rest on his belt, and took the ledger from her fingers. He didn't throw it back into the box. He placed it carefully on the top shelf, out of the dust. "Meet me tomorrow morning before the trial starts," Reed said, his voice dropping into that quiet, gravelly cowboy cadence. "At the stables. Don't talk to the girl, and don't look at Vance when he mounts the bench." He turned and walked toward the door, the lantern light moving with him. "And put your boots back on, Miss Thornton. The floorboards in the hall have cold nails, and a woman who's limping can't run when the shooting starts." The livery stable smelled of old hay, ammonia, and wet horsehair. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The rain that had been threatening since yesterday was finally coming down, a steady gray drizzle that turned the limestone dust of Pale Fork into a greasy slick. Reed Coltman stood by the open bay door, a cold cup of chicory coffee balanced in his left palm. His right hand was tucked deep inside the pocket of his oilskin slicker, finger hooked over the brass key to his desk drawer. He wasn't looking at the rain. He was listening to the rhythm of the horses behind him. A horse didn't know how to lie. If a man walked into a barn with blood on his boots, the animals knew it before the hinges stopped creaking. A shadow broke the gray light at the end of the alley. Cassie Thornton didn't carry an umbrella. She walked straight through the drizzle, her charcoal skirt pinned up out of the mud with 2 brass safety pins, her leather portfolio tucked beneath the thick fold of her wool shawl. She stepped into the dry dirt of the stable floor and didn't shake her head. She just looked at him. "You're late, Marshal," she said. Her voice had the same dry click as her typewriter keys. Reed didn't lift his coffee. "The rain slows the stage. It's 5 minutes past the hour." "5 minutes is half a deposition," she said, stepping closer until she could smell the chicory. "I don't like waiting in the dark." Reed tossed the dregs of his cup into the manure pile outside the door. He turned and walked back into the depths of the barn, toward the empty stall at the very end where the light didn't reach. Cassie followed him, her boots thudding soft on the packed earth. "I sat in my office until 3, Reed said, stopping against the rough pine partition of the stall, looking at my badge. 9 years ago, I thought that piece of tin was a shield. I thought if I held it high enough, the bad men would look at the engraving and turn around. It took me 3 years to realize the tin don't hold nothing up, but the shirt it's pinned to." He turned his face toward her. The gray light from the roof monitor caught the deep lines around his mouth. "When your father came to me in 72, Reed said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, low cowboy drawl, "he wasn't just asking for a deputy. He was asking for the United States government. He told me Vance had violated the Federal Judiciary Act by suppressing the testimony of that drifter. He said under the law, a circuit clerk's record is a sacred thing. It's the property of the federal court, and tampering with it is an act of treason against the sovereign authority of the United States." Reed paused, his fingers finding the edge of his slicker pocket. 1. 2. "I knew the statute," Reed said. "I had the book on my shelf." Section 2 of the Enforcement Acts gives a federal deputy the explicit power to arrest any local official, even a judge, who conspires to deprive a citizen of their constitutional right to a public record. The words were right there on the paper, clear as ink. But you didn't move, Cassie said. Her eyes were two dark coals in the shadows. No, Reed said. I told him I needed to compile a formal report first. I told him we needed affidavits from the grand jury foreman, a secondary verification of the land grant titles from the Austin Registry, and a certified copy of the court calendar. I used every legal term I could find to build a wall between myself and that door. I told myself I was protecting the process. I told myself that the law required absolute, unassailable proof before a marshal could lay hands on a circuit judge. He let out a short, dry breath that smelled of old tobacco. But it wasn't the process I was saving, Cassie. It was my own skin. I knew Vance had 6 regulators sitting in the saloon across the road with short-barreled Winchesters. I knew. If I pulled my iron based on your father's word alone, those 6 men would have turned my office into a slaughterhouse before the ink on the warrant was dry. I used procedural caution as an elegant legal excuse to cover up the fact that I was terrified of dying in the dirt. Cassie didn't flinch. She reached out and placed her leather portfolio on the top rail of the stall. Her finger touched the ink callus on her hand. A law that only works when it's safe to enforce it isn't law at all. Marshal, she said, her voice small but perfectly weighted. It's just an agreement among bullies. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1866, every citizen has the exact same right to the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property. When you stood still because you were afraid of the Winchesters, you didn't just abandon my father. You stripped every poor farmer and every laborer in this county of their legal existence. You handed the keys of the Constitution to a man who uses it to measure graves. Reed didn't answer her right away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his silver pocket watch, and pressed the latch. The gold case snapped open with a sharp ping. 5:30. Vance didn't kill him, Cassie, Reed said. His voice dropping so low, the horses in the adjacent stalls stopped chewing their oats to listen. Cassie's hand froze on the leather of her bag. What did you say? He didn't kill him, Reed repeated. He didn't look at her. He looked at the open case of the watch. 3 years ago, I found out where he went. He didn't hop a train east, and he ain't buried under the limestone. He's 12 miles out on the McAllister line camp. Sits in a stone cabin that belongs to the judge's brother-in-law. A prisoner, Cassie whispered. Her face had gone the color of the dry lye-water floorboards. The door ain't locked, Reed said. He's got a horse in the paddock and 3 sacks of flour delivered every winter by Vance's foreman. He could mount up and ride for Fort Worth any morning he chooses. The territory is wide open. There ain't no walls out there but the scrub oak. Then why? Shame, Reed said. He snapped the watch case shut. The sound was like a pistol shot in the empty stable. He sat in that room, and he let them take his journals. He let them force him onto a mule in his nightshirt while I watched from the porch. A man who spends his whole life believing that the truth on his paper is the strongest thing in the world don't know how to look his daughter in the eye after he's been shown it's the weakest. He stays out there because he thinks he's dead already. He stays there because he chose the exile of a coward over the sight of your face. Cassie stood perfectly still. The drizzle outside had turned into a hard driving sheet that rattled against the tin roof of the stable monitor. A long, low rumble of Texas thunder rolled over the limestone ridges, shaking the pine partitions between the stalls. She didn't reach for her journal. She didn't cry. She just reached down and took her portfolio back into her arms, holding it against her chest like a breastplate. "The trial starts at 9, Marshal," she said. Her voice didn't have any shake in it. It was cold, cold as the rain. "Ensure your shirt is clean. I have a lot of words to write today, and I want to make sure I don't miss a single one of yours." She turned and walked out of the barn, her boots sinking deep into the gray mud of the alleyway, her wool shawl soaking up the water until the fabric turned the color of lead. Reed Coltman stood in the dark stall for 5 minutes after she left. He reached up, took his Stetson off his head, and looked at the silver star pinned to his vest. Then he walked out into the rain, his hitching hip dragging through the mud, his face turned straight toward the gray stone block of the county courthouse. The cellar of the Pale Fork Courthouse didn't have windows. It was dug straight into the limestone shelf, the walls damp with a white, salty crust that looked like winter frost but tasted like lye. A single iron lantern hung from a cedar joist in the ceiling, the fat oil wick smoking grease until the air was thick enough to leave a coat on the back of a tongue. Cassie Thornton sat on the bottom step of the cellar stairs, her official ledger balanced on her knees. Marshal Reed Coltman stood 3 feet away, his back against the heavy oak door that led up to the courtroom, his arms crossed over his chest. His slicker was gone, but his flannel shirt was dark, with rainwater across the shoulders. He hadn't spoken since they came down the steps. He just stood there, a vertical line of shadow blocking the only exit. Inside the iron-barred cage in the corner, Silas Beckett sat on a 3-legged stool. His fingers were busy with a loose thread on his trousers, twisting the blue wool into a tight, hard knot until the skin beneath his fingernails turned white. "The jury's coming back at 3. "Silas," Cassie said. She didn't look at him through the bars. She kept her eyes on the blank lines of her paper. "Harmon Dwyer has 3 separate affidavits from the cattle union stating you threatened Samuel Hogue over your back wages on the 1st of the month. Under Texas criminal procedure, 3 sworn statements of intent are sufficient to establish malice aforethought. If you don't give the record something else before the gavel falls, the judge has the statutory obligation to sentence you to the gallows within 48 hours. Silas didn't look up from his thread. "The judge don't need no papers to hang me, Miss Thornton. He has had the rope greased since Tuesday. He needs the record." "Silas," Cassie said, her voice rising slightly, hitting the damp stone walls with a clear, sharp ring. "The law demands a legal foundation. Even in a county court, an appellate review can overturn a verdict if the transcript shows a material omission of the defendant's testimony. Under Section 4 of the Habeas Corpus Act, you have the absolute right to enter your full statement into the official record before the prosecution rests. If you speak the truth now, it becomes a permanent federal document. Vance cannot burn it without violating the federal archives law. It stays there forever. A line he cannot cross." Silas let go of the thread. He looked at her then, his eyes small, yellowed at the corners by tobacco smoke and prison damp. He looked past her at the silver star on Reed Coltman's chest. "The marshal won't save me," Silas said. "He didn't save your old man." Cassie's pen didn't move. "Leave my father out of this, Mr. Beckett. Speak for yourself." "I am speaking for myself," Silas said, standing up from his stool. His boots were covered in dry manure from the livery stable, where they'd found him. He walked to the iron bars, his calloused hands gripping the rusted metal until his knuckles bulged. "3 weeks ago, I went to Vance's house. Past midnight, he was sitting on his porch, drinking peach brandy out of a silver cup. I told him I knew about the night in '72. I told him I saw his foreman, Jesse Miller, riding that gray mule of your father's out toward the West Line camp. I told him I knew the drifter John Doe didn't kill nobody, that Hogue and Vance had paid that drifter 50 gold eagles to clear the title on the Maxwell Grant so they could sell the right-of-way to the railroad. Silas spat into the limestone dust at his feet. I thought I was being smart, Miss Thornton. I thought if I told him I had that secret in my pocket, he'd make Hogue pay me my 6 months' wages. I thought the truth was a piece of paper you could trade for flour and bacon. And what did the judge do? Cassie asked. He didn't say nothing, Silas said. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper that rattled in the damp cellar. He just reached out, took another silver cup from the table, and poured me 2 fingers of brandy. He told me the frontier was a big place, and a man with an eye for details could find himself a nice piece of land if he knew how to keep his mouth shut. Then he walked me down to the gate himself, his hand on my shoulder, like we was brothers. Silas looked at Reed. The next morning, Samuel Hogue was dead at the bottom of the paddock fence, and Jesse Miller was standing at my kitchen door with 3 deputies and a warrant for murder signed by Thaddeus Vance. The judge didn't frame me because he thought I killed Hogue. He framed me because I tried to sell him back his own sin, and he found out my price was cheaper than a hemp rope. Cassie's hand was a machine again. He framed me because I tried to sell him back his own sin. She stopped the nib. She didn't blot the line. She let the black ink stay thick and wet on the rag paper. "You knew this 3 weeks ago, Marshal?" Cassie asked. She didn't turn her head toward the door. She kept her face directed at the iron bars. Reed Coltman didn't move his arms from his chest. "I knew Silas went to the house. I didn't know what was said. You didn't ask?" "Silas Beckett is a horse thief and a card sharp, Cassie," Reed said, his voice flat as the limestone shelf. "Under the Texas rules of evidence, the uncorroborated statement of an interested party with a prior criminal record isn't sufficient to issue a federal warrant against a sitting judicial officer. If I'd gone to Austin with nothing but Silas S. word, the district attorney would have thrown me out of the office before I finished the first paragraph. I needed the papers from '72. I needed the chain of custody for that forged signature. I was waiting for the circuit clerk to arrive, so I had a legal anchor for the filing. "You were waiting for me to do your digging for you," Cassie said. She stood up from the wooden step, her ledger tucked beneath her arm, her eyes fixed on his silver star. "You used Silas Beckett as bait, in a trap you were too cautious to set yourself. You let Vance frame an innocent man for murder just so you could have a clean file for your federal district attorney." "He ain't innocent, Cassie," Reed said, his voice dropping into that quiet, hard cowboy cadence. "He tried to blackmail a judge with a man's life. That makes him a felon under the territorial code before he ever touched a paddock fence." "He's a citizen, Marshal," Cassie said, stepping up until she was 6 inches from his chest. She could smell the wet wool of his shirt, the stale tobacco, the old iron. And under the 14th Amendment, the state cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Silas Beckett might be a thief, and he might be a blackmailer, but he has a right to be tried for the crimes he committed, not the ones Thaddeus Vance invented to keep himself out of the federal penitentiary. When you allow a judge to pervert the grand jury process to protect a land grab, you aren't waiting for evidence. You're assisting in an execution. Reed didn't move. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the lantern flame above her head. 1, 2. "The court opens in 20 minutes, Miss Thornton," he said. He reached out his left hand, turned the brass knob of the door behind him, and held it open for her. The gray light of the courtroom stairs flooded into the dark cellar, smelling of old pine and rain-damp wool. "Get your ink ready. The judge don't like to wait for his transcript." Cassie looked at him for 3 seconds, the exact duration of a court-ordered pause. Then she gathered her skirt in her left hand and walked past him up the steps. She didn't look back at the cage. She didn't look at the man with the silver tin on his chest. Behind her, in the dark limestone hole, Silas Beckett began twisting his blue thread again, his boots scraping quiet against the white dust of a floor that had never seen the sun. The afternoon session didn't begin with a gavel. It began with the smell of wet wood ash. The stove in the corner of Judge Vance's private chambers was cold, but the hearth was full of charcoal scraps. The room was larger than the office at the livery. It had 3 glass windows that looked west toward the limestone hills. A Brussels carpet with red roses woven into the wool, and 2 leather chairs that smelled of linseed oil. Reed Coltman sat in the smaller chair. He kept his Stetson on his knee, his thumbs hooked over the brim, counting the ticks of the regulator clock on the wall. 60 ticks to a minute, 3,600 to an hour. A man could build a lot of lies in 3,600 seconds. Thaddeus Vance stood by the middle window, his back to the room. His black coat was off, hanging from a brass peg by the door. His white linen shirt was spotless, despite the mud in the street outside. "She's an efficient girl, Reed," Vance said. He didn't turn around. He was watching a team of 6 mules drag a timber wagon through the gray muck by the land office. "She doesn't waste ink. She writes the pauses. Did you know that? She marks down the silences like they were spoken words." "She's a Thornton," Reed said. "Yes," Vance said, turning slow. His eyes were bright, almost clear under his gray brows. "I knew that before her stagecoach crossed the county line. The circuit clerk-ass registry in Austin sends out the monthly rosters 30 days in advance. I saw the name, Cassandra Thornton, on the August listing. I could have written to the district supervisor. I could have requested a replacement with 2 years seniority. But I didn't." Reed didn't shift his boots. "Why?" "Because a ghost is an uncomfortable thing to have under your bed, Reed," Vance said. He walked over to his large cedar desk, sat down, and picked up a silver pocket knife. He began shaving the tip of a cedar pencil, the pale curls of wood falling onto his green blotter like dried skin. "For 9 years, this town has been looking over its shoulder. Every time a stranger rides in from the east, the saloon goes quiet. Every time a new deputy takes the oath, people look at his boots to see if they're the same size as the tracks by the creek back in '72. I wanted her here. I wanted her to look at the books, find that voluntary departure entry, see her father's name written in clean black ink, and take that certainty back to Philadelphia. A woman with an official record goes home. A woman with questions stays and digs." "The signature is a forgery, Thaddeus," Reed said. His voice was a flat rumble, matching the rhythm of the rain against the glass. Vance didn't stop his knife. "Shave, slide, drop. A legal fiction, Reed," Vance said, looking up, his face perfectly reasonable, almost kind. "That's what the textbooks call it. Go look at the Texas Organization Act of 1876. Under the Frontier Defense Clauses, a local magistrate has the explicit authority to execute administrative corrections to the county logs if the preservation of public tranquility is at stake. In September of '72, Arthur Thornton wasn't just recording a trial. He was preparing to file an information with the federal circuit judge that would have invalidated every cattle brand and every timber deed between here and the Brazos River. He wanted to enforce the strict letter of the Maxwell grant, a piece of paper written by a Spanish clerk who had never seen a longhorn. Vance set the knife down on the desk with a dull clink. If that information had been filed, 500 families in this valley would have been vagrants by winter. The cattle union would have burned the land office, and the regulators would have turned the town into a shooting box. I didn't remove Arthur because I hated him, Reed. I removed him because the law is a tool for the living, not a monument for the dead. The survival of the community outranks the literal mechanics of the transcript. I provided order when the state couldn't. That isn't a crime, Marshal. That's governance. Reed looked down at the silver star on his vest. The metal felt heavy against his ribs, like an iron stove lid. The Federal Enforcement Act don't care about your tranquility, Thaddeus, Reed said, his words coming slow, spaced out like cedar posts along a fence line. Under Section 5, the forced removal of a federal officer or the systematic alteration of an official transcript by a state official is defined as a felony against the sovereign authority of the United States. It don't give you no exceptions for 500 families, and it don't give you no exceptions for cattle grass. The law says the paper must stand because if the paper can be cut with a razor every time a judge gets scared of a shootout, then the entire structure of the government is just grease on a wheel. You didn't save this town, Thaddeus. You just turned yourself into the only man who's allowed to break the rules. Vance smiled. It was the same frozen smile he'd used in the courtroom. An elegant argument, Marshal. Write it down in your report. Send it to Fort Worth on the Monday stage. Let's see if the district judge wants to ride 12 days through Comanche country to tell 400 Texas cattlemen that their deeds are no good because of a traveling clerk who couldn't keep his mouth shut. He stood up, putting his black coat back on, his movements smooth and practiced. The jury is coming back in 10 minutes, Reed. Ensure your deputies are at the rail. Silas Beckett is going to receive his sentence, and I don't want no unseemly noise in my court. Reed didn't wait for Vance to open the door. He stood up, rammed his Stetson onto his head, and walked out into the corridor. The air outside the chambers smelled of old wool and horse liniment. He didn't go back to the rail. He walked down the courthouse steps, into the gray mist of the afternoon street. The mud was deep now, suctioning around his boot soles with a thick, wet slap. Maeve Logan was sitting on an overturned salt pork barrel under the awning of the dry goods store. She had her old copy of Elements of Law and Equity on her lap, the leather cover gray with rain spots. She didn't look up when his hitching hip brought him to a stop beside her. He's still out there, Marshal, the girl said. Her finger tracing a line of print she'd probably read 20 times. The old man, my brother, rode out to the West Line camp yesterday to check the salt licks, said he. Saw him sitting on the stone well curb, sharpening a cedar pencil with an old Barlow knife, said. He looked like a piece of wood that had been left in the creek until the skin went white. Reed pulled a piece of dry leaf from his pocket and began tearing it into tiny squares. He say anything to your brother? Said the same thing he always says, Maeve replied, looking up. Her blue eyes were flat as the sky before a norther. He asked if the circuit clerk had come through yet. My brother told him. Yeah, a woman with a gray skirt and an ink spot on her finger. The old man didn't move for 5 minutes. Then he went back inside and shut the door. Didn't even draw the latch, just let it hang. She closed the book with a soft thud. He's waiting for her, Mr. Coltman. He's been waiting 9 years for someone to come tell him. He's allowed to get on his horse and go home. Why don't you go get him? Reed threw the torn leaf into the gray mud. Because a man who's been in a hole that long don't always know what to do with the light, mate. Sometimes he just wants to stay in the dark, where it's quiet. That ain't your choice, Maeve said, standing up and tucking the book under her canvas sleeve. That's her choice. You tell her where he is, Marshall. If you don't, you just the man who has turned the key on both of them. She walked away down the boardwalk, her bare feet loud against the wet cedar boards. Reed stood there until the rain cleared a narrow strip of sky over the west ridge, a thin, yellow line of light that looked like a razor cut across the gray face of the world. The lamp in Cassie Thornton's boarding house room didn't have a glass chimney. It was just a tin saucer of lard oil with a braided rag wick that sputtered every time the wind hit the loose sash of the window. The smell of burning fat was thick, mixing with the damp scent of her wool shawl, drying over the back of the single willow chair. Cassie sat on the edge of the shuck mattress, her personal journal open on her knees. The pages were blank. She held her steel pen 3 inches above the paper, her hand perfectly still, waiting for her mind to find the first word. Arthur, she thought. Arthur Thornton. The name didn't look like her father anymore. It looked like a legal title, a case file, a dead entity listed in an Austin archive. 3 sharp, regular thuds shook the thin pine door of her room. 1, 2, 3. It's Coltman. The voice came through the panel, low and dry as a dry paddock wind. Cassie didn't close the journal. She set it on the mattress beside her, stood up and drew the iron bolt. Marshall Reed Coltman stood in the narrow hallway. He had his Stetson in his hand, his hair damp and silvered by the mist. He looked smaller without his oilskin slicker, his shoulders rounded under his flannel shirt as if he were carrying an extra sack of grain. He didn't ask to come in. He just looked at the blank paper on her bed. Vance didn't sign the warrant for Silas, Reed said, stepping across the threshold until his boots hit the bare pine floor. He postponed the sentencing until Monday morning. He wants the gallery full when he reads the decree. He thinks if there's enough people watching, it makes the rope look like it belongs to the state instead of him. Silas Beckett told me about the Gold Eagles, Marshall, Cassie said, her voice flat, devoid of the professional cadence she used during the day. He told me. Vance paid the Drifter 50 Eagles to clear the title on the Maxwell grant. He told me my father wrote that down on page 4 of the transcript. Reed walked over to the window, his hitching hip dragging slightly on the rag rug. He looked out at the dark street of Pale Fork, just 3 oil lamps burning in the saloon windows across the road, their yellow light smeared across the gray mud like grease. He did, Reed said. Arthur wrote every word. He had the name of the teamster, the date of the payment, and the specific section line where the money changed hands. That is what Vance couldn't let leave the room. And you found him 3 years ago, Cassie said. She didn't move from the center of the floor. Her hands were tucked inside her sleeves. Her fingers pressed hard against her ribs. You found my father 12 miles from here, living in a stone hut on Vance's land, and you didn't send a letter. You didn't tell the registry. You left me in Philadelphia for 36 months, believing I was an orphan. Reed didn't turn around. He kept his face toward the dark glass. He asked me not to, Cassie. He asked you. He didn't have no boots on when I found him, Reed said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, low cowboy cadence, each word separated by a tiny, painful pause. He was sitting on a cedar block in that cabin, wearing an old linsey-woolsey shirt that had gone gray from creek water. He had 3 years of beard on his chin, white as wool. I laid my badge on the table right in front of him. I told him I had a fresh horse outside, and a federal escort waiting at the county line. I told him we could be in Fort Worth before the grand jury finished its term. Reed stopped. 1, 2. He looked at the star on that tin, Cassie, Reed said. Then he looked down at his own knuckles. He told me he couldn't get on the horse. He said, the night they came to his boarding house room. He didn't fight him, he said. Jesse Miller Vance's foreman, was a boy Arthur had taught to read 2 winters before. When Jesse took him by the elbow, Arthur didn't shout. He didn't call for the law. He just took his spectacles off his nose, folded them neat, and put them in his pocket so they wouldn't get broken in the scuffle. Reed turned around slow, his gray eyes old and hollow in the sputtering lard light. A man who spends 30 years believing that the written law is a wall of iron don't know how to live with himself after he finds out a 20-year-old boy can dismantle that wall with one hand on his shirt. He told me the shame of that night was heavier than any iron chain Vance could buy. He said, if he went back to Philadelphia, every time you looked at him across the supper table, he'd see himself standing in his nightshirt, folding his glasses like a coward while the law stayed silent across the road. He stepped toward her, his heavy hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, then dropping back to his side. He told me, Reed, don't tell her I'm here. Let her think I died like a man of the law. Let her think I was killed for the record. Don't let her see me sitting in the dirt, eating another man's flour, because I was too scared to die. Cassie felt the coldness rise from the floorboards, through her stockings, straight to her throat. She looked past Reed at the blank journal on the mattress. Who gave him the right to choose that for me? She asked. Her voice didn't have any volume, but it had the weight of 9 years of winter. Who gave either of you the right to turn my grief into an administrative decision? He wanted to protect his pride, Marshall. He wanted to keep his memory pristine in my head, so he wouldn't have to face the reality of his own flesh. That isn't love. That's a secondary imprisonment? He let Thaddeus Vance erase his identity, and then he used your silence to lock the door from the inside. He was trying to save you from the truth, Cassie, Reed said. The truth doesn't need to be saved, Marshall, Cassie said, her eyes snapping to his face, her voice rhythmic, hard, and perfectly clear. Under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, every person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen, and no state has the right to abridge the privileges or immunities of that citizenship. One of those privileges is the right to a public existence, the right to be listed in the records, to sign your own name, to see your children without permission from a county judge. When my father chose to become a ghost because he was ashamed of his own weakness, he didn't just abandon his civil rights. He abandoned mine. He made me a partner in his erasure, without my consent. She walked over to the bed, picked up her personal journal, and dipped her pen into the small traveling inkwell on the washstand. Her hand didn't shake. She wrote 4 lines, her nib scratching loud against the paper. Arthur Thornton is alive, 12 miles west, McAllister Line Camp. He stays because of his pride. The marshal is his keeper. She blew on the ink until it went dull. Then she turned to Reed, her shawl slipping from her shoulder, exposing the ink callus on her middle finger. We have 2 days before Monday's session, Marshal, Cassie said. You have a federal badge, and I have 2 books of evidence. On Monday morning, we are either going to ride out to that line camp and bring an American citizen back into the light of the law, or I'm going to open my official ledger and write down the exact longitude and latitude of your cowardice for the federal circuit judge to read. Reed Coltman looked at the 4 lines she'd written, his jaw locked, the tiny pulse in his temple beating once, twice in the quiet room. The horses will be saddled at 4, Miss Thornton, the silent cowboy said. He picked up his Stetson, turned toward the dark hallway, and drew the latch. Wear your heavy coat. The West Ridge has stone chimneys, and the wind up there don't care about the 14th Amendment or the name on your paper. He stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him, like a key turning in a lock, leaving Cassie alone with the smell of the burning fat and the cold, wet reality of a father who had been closer than the rain for 3 long, silent years. The sky at 4 in the morning wasn't blue or black. It was the color of a wet slate shingle. Reed Coltman stood by the saddle room door, pulling the latigo strap on his big buckskin gelding until the leather creaked like an old floorboard. His joints ached. Not from the rain, from the memory of 9 years of standing still. Every time he pulled a cinch, he felt the weight of that Tuesday night in '72, when he let a man's nightshirt disappear into the dark without lifting his iron. The mud in the stable yard was quiet. Cassie Thornton didn't make a sound until her boots hit the cedar sill of the doorway. She wore her heavy wool coat, the collar turned up high enough to brush her earlobes. Her hair was tied back tight with a piece of black ribbon, regular and neat, as if she were preparing to sit at her desk instead of mounting a horse in a Texas drizzle. Her leather portfolio was wrapped in an oilskin cloth, tied to her pommel with 2 pieces of hemp string. Reed didn't look at her face. He handed her the reins to a deep-chested gray mare. "She's steady," he said. "Don't fight her mouth. She knows the limestone." Cassie took the leather. "We missing the morning calendar, Marshal." "The calendar can wait," Reed said, swung his leg over the buckskin, and settled into the damp saddle. "Vance don't open the doors until 9. We have 4 hours to ride 12 miles and find out if we bringing back a witness or a ghost." They rode out through the alley, behind the livery, the horses' hooves making a thick, rhythmic suck-plop in the gray muck. The town of Pale Fork didn't look like nothing but a pile of wet lumber against the ridge. No lamps burning. No smoke from the chimneys yet. Just a place where people lived under a roof because they were scared of what was outside. They hit the west trail where the limestone began to rise. The scrub oak grew low and twisted here, their branches gray with Spanish moss that hung down like old wool rags. "I looked in the mirror this morning, Cassie," Reed said, after they'd cleared the first ridge. He didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the narrow path between the stones. "I looked at my face, and I saw Thaddeus Vance looking back at me." Cassie's mare stayed half a horse length behind him. "You aren't Vance, Reed." "Ain't I?" Reed said. His buckskin stumbled once on a loose flint, then found its footing. "Vance took your father because he thought he knew what was best for the county. He called it public tranquility. Arthur stayed in that cabin because he thought he knew what was best for your memory. He called it pride. And I kept his secret because I told myself I was respecting his choice. But when you strip away the pretty words, Cassie, all 3 of us did the exact same thing." He stopped the buckskin on the crest of the hill. "1, 2. We took your right to know the truth, and we buried it under our own convenience," Reed said, his voice dropping into that slow, gravelly cowboy cadence. "I told myself for 3 years that I was protecting you from the pain of seeing him broken. But I wasn't saving you, girl. I was saving myself from the trouble of having to tell a daughter that the United States Marshal didn't have the stomach to protect her father when it counted. That ain't respect. That S just a polite way of being a coward." Cassie pulled her gray mare up beside him. The mist was sitting in the hollows below them like white wool batting. "At least you know the name for it now. Marshal," she said. Her voice was short, matching the clip of her horse walk. Most men out here die before they find out what they're hiding behind. We ain't going out there to beg his pardon, Cassie, Reed said, turning the buckskin down the reverse slope. We going out there because the law requires his body in that room on Monday morning. Under Section 3 of the Federal Judiciary Act, if a federal circuit court reporter is prevented from performing his statutory duties by force or intimidation, the United States Marshal has the explicit mandate to produce that officer before the federal magistrate, regardless of any local administrative orders or county warrants. Your father ain't just a man in a cabin anymore. He's a piece of federal evidence that Thaddeus can't explain away. He's my father first. Reed, Cassie said. Out here, Reed said, not looking back. The law don't care about the blood, Cassie. The law just cares about the name on the paper. They rode in silence for 2 hours. The rain stopped at around 7, leaving the air cold and clear, the limestone ridges looking like old white teeth against the gray sky. The McAllister line camp sat at the bottom of a deep draw, where a small spring came out from the rock shelf. It wasn't nothing but a one-room cabin built of rough-cut limestone blocks, the roof covered in sods that had grown over with wild mustard weeds. A small corral made of cedar posts stood to the side. Inside the corral, a lean bay horse with a federal brand on its hip stood with its head down, its tail tucked against the morning wind. Reed pulled the buckskin to a halt, 50 yards from the door. He didn't pull his Winchester from the scabbard. He didn't reach for his iron. He just sat there, his hands resting loose on the horn, his hat tilted back from his forehead. "Arthur!" Reed shouted. His voice cracked through the quiet draw like a dry branch. "Arthur Thornton! Get your boots on!" The heavy cedar door of the cabin didn't swing wide. It creaked open 3 inches, then stopped. A face appeared in the gap. It was an old face, white as a scrubbed bone, with a long, unkempt silver beard that reached the second button of his linsey shirt. On his nose had a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. One of the lenses cracked across the middle by a thin gray line that looked like a spider leg. The old man looked at Reed. Then his eyes slid past the buckskin, past the silver star on Reed's vest, and hit the gray mare. Cassie didn't wait for Reed to dismount. She slid out of her saddle, her charcoal skirt dragging through the dry mustard weeds, and walked straight toward the stone door. She didn't run. She walked with that same measured, professional stride she used when entering the courtroom. Arthur Thornton stepped out onto the flat stone sill. He didn't have his boots on. His feet were wrapped in dirty wool rags tied with green garden twine. He looked at her through the cracked lens of his spectacles, his mouth opening once, twice, like a fish out of water. "Cassie," he whispered. The girl stopped 5 feet from the step. She didn't reach out her arms. She didn't fall to her knees. She just stood there, her portfolio tucked tight beneath her arm, her ink callus visible against the gray wool of her coat. "You're 9 years behind on your logs, Father," she said. Her voice didn't have no shake in it, but it was low, low, and hard, like the stone beneath their feet. "Get your coat. The Monday session starts at 9, and we have a transcript to finish." The county courtroom was full at 8:30. 40 men sat on the oak gallery benches, their shoulders jammed together like sheep in a loading chute. The air was thick, with the smell of wet wool, tobacco juice, and the greasy grease of 40 slickers drying in the heat of the wood stove. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The news had gone through the saloon lines before the rain stopped. The marshal had ridden out west at dawn, and he hadn't ridden alone. Thaddeus Vance sat on his elevated bench, his black coat immaculate, his silver hair brushed back tight from his temples. He was reading a land title map, his thumb smoothing down the parchment with a slow, regular stroke. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the door. At 9 o'clock exactly, the side door behind the rail creaked open. Cassie Thornton walked in first. She had changed her dress. She wore her clean charcoal gray traveling linen, the cuffs white and stiff. She sat down at the clerk's desk, opened her official ledger to page 42, and dipped her steel nib into the black inkwell. Her hand was a machine, stable, cold. Behind her came Reed Coltman. He didn't have his slicker on. His flannel shirt was clean, his silver star pinned exactly 2 inches above his pocket seam. His right hand rested loose against his gun belt, his thumb hooked over the iron buckle. And behind Reed walked the ghost. Arthur Thornton wore an old wool coat that belonged to the marshal, the sleeves 3 inches too long for his thin arms. His silver beard was combed, but his feet were still loud in a pair of oversized trail boots Reed had given him at the cabin. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the judge. He walked straight to the witness rail and stood there, his hand gripping the cedar post until his knuckles went white. The room didn't just go quiet. It went dead. A man in the second row dropped his pipe onto the floorboards, and the rattle of the briar bowl sounded like a shot. Judge Vance didn't lift his eyes from his map for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he looked down. His face didn't go pale. It didn't tighten. His eyes just grew very small, very bright, like 2 gray beads behind his spectacles. "This court is in session," Vance said. His voice was smooth as oil, but it didn't have no heat in it. "We are here for the final disposition of the state of Texas versus Silas Beckett. The jury has delivered a verdict of guilty. Mr. Beckett, stand and receive your sentence." Silas Beckett stood up in his iron cage, his hands gripping the bars, his eyes fixed on Arthur Thornton's silver beard. Reed Coltman stepped past the rail. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't look at the deputies by the door. He walked straight to the center of the floor, right between the prosecutor's table and the bench, and looked up at the portraits on the back wall. "Come with me now," the silent cowboy said. The words were quiet, but they hit the stone walls with a flat, final ring. Vance's hand froze on his land map. The 40 men in the gallery braced their feet against the floorboards, their eyes darting to the short Winchesters carried by the local deputies at the door. Nobody was ready for what happened next. Reed didn't reach for his bang. He didn't invite Vance to a shootout in the street. He reached into his inside coat pocket, pulled out a thick sheet of blue parchment with a gold federal seal at the corner, and laid it flat on the prosecutor's table. "This court is overridden, Thaddeus," Reed said, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic cowboy drawl that filled every corner of the silent room. Under Section 3 of the Federal Judiciary Act of 1875, a United States Marshal has the explicit executive authority to suspend any local or county proceeding if there is probable cause to believe that a federal officer has been deprived of his civil rights through force, intimidation, or institutional fraud by a state magistrate. This warrant was issued by the United States District Court in Fort Worth. It names you, Thaddeus Vance, as a co-conspirator in the forced disappearance of Circuit Clerk Arthur Thornton in September of 1872. Vance didn't touch his gavel. He leaned over his bench, his teeth showing behind his gray mustache. "You have no jurisdiction here, Coltman. This is a county court, organized under the sovereign statutes of the state of Texas. A federal warrant cannot stay a capital sentence for a local murder. It can, if the murder charge was manufactured to conceal a federal felony. You're Honor, Cassie Thornton said. She didn't stand up from her desk. She didn't look up from her ledger. Her voice was perfectly level, matching the scratch of her pen as she logged her own words into the official transcript. Under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, Cassie said, her words coming regular and clear as clockwork, no state or county authority may enforce a law that denies any citizen within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. When you suppress the testimony of John Doe in 1872, and when you falsified the administrative logs to show a voluntary departure for Arthur Thornton, you committed a felony against the federal judiciary. Silas Beckett's incarceration was a direct execution of that conspiracy. This record is now being entered into the Federal Archive. Every word spoken in this room is being transmitted directly to the Department of Justice. Your court is no longer sovereign, Judge Vance. Your court is a crime scene. Vance's eyes snapped to Cassie. He looked at her inked finger. He looked at the blue parchment on the table. Then he looked at the 40 men in the gallery. The cattlemen weren't looking at the judge anymore. They were looking at Arthur Thornton, who had reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn piece of rag paper, the original page 5 that had been cut from the ledger 9 years ago, preserved in an oilskin pouch beneath his shirt for 3,300 days. I have the transcript. Thaddeus, the old clerk said. His voice was thin, but it didn't shake. I have the name you told the drifter to shoot. It's written right here in my own hand, and the ink don't fade just because you hide it in the brush. Vance looked at the paper. He looked at the deputies by the door. The 2 deputies didn't look back at him. They had stepped away from the Winchester rack, their hands resting loose on their hips, their eyes fixed on the floorboards. They were local boys. They knew how to handle a horse thief, but they didn't know how to shoot their way out of a federal indictment. The judge sat back in his chair. His hand moved slow, picking up his horn-rimmed spectacles and wiping them with his silk handkerchief, his movements perfectly measured, perfectly reasonable, even while his empire fell apart on the green blotter below him. An impressive performance, Marshal, Vance murmured. Let us see how your federal judge likes the road through Comanche country when the cattle union stops paying the tax for the deputies. Reed Coltman didn't answer him. He walked over to the iron cage, pulled the brass key from his pocket, and unlocked the latch. The door swung open with a long, rusty scream. Step out, Silas, Reed said. You're being transferred to Fort Worth under a federal writ. You'll be tried for blackmail by a jury that don't owe Thaddeus Vance no grass money. Silas Beckett stepped out of the cage, his boots loud on the pine floor. He didn't say thank you. He didn't look at the marshal. He walked over to Arthur Thornton, looked at the silver beard, and nodded once. In the back row of the gallery, Maeve Logan sat with her copy of Elements of Law and Equity closed on her knees. She had a small cedar pencil in her fingers, and she was writing on the inside cover of the leather binding, her face perfectly serious as she logged the final count of the room. Cassie Thornton didn't look at the girl. She didn't look at her father. She dipped her pen into the inkwell, her right hand moving with that same mechanical precision, finishing the line on page 42. Marshal Coltman executes federal warrant at 9:14 a.m. Defendant Vance yields the bench. Court adjourned by order of the United States. She laid her blotter over the text, pressed it down with the flat of her palm, and closed the book. The leather cover came together with a soft, heavy thud that sounded like an iron door closing on 9 years of silence. The road back from the west draw didn't have no shade. The clouds had broken by noon, leaving the Texas sky a wide, hard blue that looked like it had been scrubbed with lye until the color was cold. 3 horses moved in a single file along the limestone ridge. Reed Coltman led the way on his big buckskin, his hitching hip swaying regular with the animal's walk. Behind him came Arthur Thornton, his long wool sleeves flapping in the wind like gray wings. Cassie rode the tail. She kept the gray mare 4 feet back, her leather portfolio tied tight to the pommel, her eyes fixed on the silver hair of her father's beard. Nobody talked. Out here, when the wind came off the plains, it took your words before they could hit the next man's ear. You didn't waste your breath unless you had something to say that could out-talk the stone. They hit the town limits at 3 o'clock. Pale Fork didn't look different, but it felt different. The saloon door was open, but the piano wasn't hitting no keys. The teamsters by the land office had stopped their wagons, their hands resting on the brake levers, watching the 3 horses move down the center of the mud street. They didn't stop at the courthouse. Reed turned his buckskin toward the Constance boarding house, a 2-story frame building with white paint that had peeled down to the gray cedar under the sun. Mrs. Constance Hale was waiting on the porch. She was 62, with a face like a dried apple and hands that had buried 2 husbands before the railroad came. She looked at Arthur's rag-wrapped feet. Then she looked at Cassie's ink callus. She didn't ask no questions. The corner. "Room's ready, Arthur," she said, her voice short and dry. "I put a clean sheet on the shuck and 2 biscuits in the tin." The old clerk slid out of Reed's saddle. His knees gave way when his trail boots hit the dirt, but he didn't let Reed catch him. He grabbed the porch post with his thin fingers, his knuckles going white under the gray hair, and stabilized his own weight. He looked at Cassie for one beat of his heart, through his cracked spectacle lens. "I have some reading to do, daughter," he said. His voice was small, but it didn't have no bend in it. "The ledger is closed for the weekend, Father," Cassie said, her hand resting on her pommel. "The Monday term don't open until 9. Arthur nodded once, slow, then turned and walked into the dark hallway of the house, his boots making a heavy, flat thud-thud on the cedar floor until the door of the corner room clicked shut. Cassie didn't get down from her horse. She watched the door close. Then she looked at Reed. The marshal was still sitting on his buckskin, his hat tilted back, his eyes fixed on the empty street. "He isn't going back to Philadelphia, Reed," she said. Reed turned his horse slow, his knee brushing against her mare's flank. "A man who's been under the limestone that long don't go back east, Cassie. The houses are too close together. The ceilings are too low. He'd expend the whole night looking for the sky through the plaster." He hooked his thumb over his belt buckle. "Come to the office. We have the final returns to file before the stagecoach leaves." The marshal's office smelled of old tobacco, cold lard, and wet leather. Reed sat down behind his cedar desk, pulled a large, leather-bound volume from the bottom shelf, and laid it open on the green blotter. It was the Federal Registry of Cometals. He didn't pick up a pen. He looked at the silver star pinned to his shirt. "Under the Federal Judiciary Act of 1875, Cassie?" Reed said, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic cowboy drawl, each phrase separated by a tiny, deliberate pause. "A United States Marshal has 48 hours to certify a jurisdictional override before the state attorney can file an injunction. If I don't enter the specific statute lines into this ledger before sundown, Thaddeus Vance's lawyers can claim a procedural defect in Fort Worth. They can argue that the federal warrant was executed without the proper statutory foundation, and a circuit judge in Austin could release him on a state bond before he ever sees a federal grand jury. He looked up at her, his gray eyes flat and serious in the afternoon light. The law don't care about the truth we found out. At that line camp, girl. The law just cares about the timing of the entry. If the paper ain't signed within the statutory period, the crime don't exist to the court. The paperwork is the only thing that keeps the cage locked. Cassie walked over to the desk. She didn't untie her portfolio. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets, looking down at the open page of the registry. "Then write the entry, Marshal," she said. Her voice was steady, regular, matching the tick of the clock on the wall. Section 3, Clause 2, conspiracy to subvert a federal officer. The precedent is the United States versus Cruikshank. It gives you the total authority to hold him without bail until the circuit judge arrives. Reed picked up the steel pen, dipped it into the black inkwells, and began to write. His hand was heavy, the metal nib scratching loud against the paper, leaving those thick, ragged trenches he learned to make when he was 32 and scared of the short Winchesters. Conspiracy to subvert. He finished the line, laid the blotter over the wet ink, and pressed it down with his palm. He didn't look up. "Pale Fork is going to need a permanent clerk, Cassie," he said, his back still rounded under his flannel shirt. "The circuit rider system don't work when the county judge is in the county jail. The town council met at the land office while we were riding back. They want to petition the federal supervisor for a resident clerk, someone who stays, someone who don't hop the stage when the trial's over." Cassie looked out the window. Maeve Logan was standing by the well curb across the street, her old canvas smock flapping against her shins. She had her book under her arm, but she wasn't reading it. She was watching the courthouse door. "The resident clerk has to be appointed by the federal district judge, Reed," Cassie said. She spoke slow, letting her words hit the rhythm of the clock. "Under the civil service rules, a resident clerk must maintain a neutral repository of all public land deeds, brand registries, and criminal transcripts. They cannot be related to the local executive branch, and they cannot hold land within the county lines. That's a lonely job. You spend your whole day writing down what other people do, and you don't get no vote when the council decides on the taxes." Reed stood up, his hitching hip making a dull click as he straightened his leg. He walked over to the window and stood beside her, his shoulder an inch from her wool coat. "It's an honest piece of paper, Cassie," he said, his voice dropping low. "A resident clerk is the only thing that keeps a town like this from turning into a shooting box every time a big cattleman wants more grass. If you stay, the paper stays clean. If you leave, Vance Foreman will find another clerk who knows how to use a razor on page 4. Cassie looked down at her right hand. Her index finger traced the hard ink callus on her middle finger. She'd just spent 4 years moving from town to town, sleeping on mattresses that smelled of other people as sweat, writing down confessions from men who were going to hang before her ink went dry. She'd never stayed anywhere long enough to see the grass green over the graves she'd logged. "My stagecoach leaves at 6 on Tuesday morning, Marshal," she said. She didn't look at his face. "I have a contract with the circuit supervisor in Austin for 3 more terms in Red Rock. Red Rock can find another pen," Reed said. "The supervisor don't like breaches of contract, Reed. I'll write him a letter," the silent cowboy said. "On federal stationery." He won't argue with the star. They stood there until the sun dropped below the limestone ridge, casting a long red shadow across the gray mud of the street. The light looked like old copper on the courthouse windows. 1 year later, Audium, 1879. The heat was gone from the valley now. The wind came from the north, smelling of dry cedar needles and early frost. Cassie Thornton walked up the stone steps of the Pale Fork County Courthouse at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. She wore her clean charcoal traveling linen, the fabric faded at the elbows but immaculate. She didn't carry her leather portfolio anymore. She didn't need to. Her supplies were already inside. The courtroom was empty. The 40 men from the cattle union were out on the range, pulling calves before the first norther hit the grass. The 3 oil portraits of Thaddeus Vance were gone from the back wall. In their place hung a single framed copy of the Texas Declaration of Independence. The parchment, yellowed and wrinkled, but straight between the pine molding. A small wooden table sat by the stove in the corner. Arthur Thornton sat at the table, a thick gray wool shawl over his shoulders, his wire-rimmed spectacles held together at the bridge with a neat turn of green garden twine. He didn't have his rags on his feet. He wore a pair of clean calfskin shoes Mrs. Constance had found in a trunk. He had 3 children sitting on the bench before him, 2 boys from the livery stables, and Maeve Logan. Maeve was 15 now. Her canvas smock was gone, replaced by a blue calico dress that reached her ankles, but her hair was still tied back with that same greasy piece of rawhide. She had her copy of Elements of Law and Equity open on the table, her finger tracing a paragraph, while Arthur watched her through his cracked lens. "Read the section on municipal corporations." "Maeve," the old man said. His voice was stronger than it had been at the camp, though it still had that thin paper-dry rustle. Maeve cleared her throat, her voice rhythmic and clear in the quiet room. "A municipal corporation, being a creature of the sovereign state, cannot exercise any power not explicitly granted by its charter. Any administrative act that exceeds the scope of that charter is ultra vires, null and void from its inception, and cannot be enforced by the local magistrate." "What's that mean in the dirt, child?" Arthur asked, leaning forward. "It means if the judge don't have the paper from Austin saying he allowed to survey the south side 5 acres, he can't touch my grandmother S. house," Maeve said, looking up with those flat blue eyes. "It means the paper outranks his boots." Arthur nodded once, a tiny smile disappearing into his silver beard. "Good. Write that down in the margin. Use a light hand. Don't dig the metal into the rag." Cassie watched them from the railing. She didn't speak. She walked to the clerk's desk the same. Oaked as the wood, scrubbed with lye, until the grain was pale and dry as salt. She sat down in the chair. The cedar's seat was hard beneath her. She reached out her right hand, her fingers, moving by habit, toward the left corner of the top, and let her palm drop. Her hand fit the worn oval groove perfectly. The indentation wasn't a stranger's mark anymore. It was her own anchor. Her father had carved it with 9 days of fear in 1872, and she had filled it with 12 months of certainty in 1878. The wood had taken the shape of their name, a permanent record of 2 people who had used a steel pen to stop a hanging. A shadow blocked the light from the street door. Marshal Reed Coltman walked into the courtroom. He had a new flannel shirt on, the red check bright against his gray trousers, his silver star pinned exactly 2 inches above his pocket seam. He walked with that same slow, rolling hitch in his right hip, his boots making a heavy, dull thud on the pine floorboards. He didn't take off his Stetson. He walked to the side of her desk, leaned his hip against the railing, and looked down at her open ledger. The pages were clean, white, and empty, waiting for the 9 o'clock call. "The Monday stagecoach is on time, Cassie," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, matching the rattle of the wood stove pipe in the wind. Cassie didn't look up from her inkwell. Any travelers? Just a land surveyor from Fort Worth, Reed said. Got a bundle of maps and a letter of introduction from the Federal Registry. Says he needs to verify the section lines on the Maxwell grant before the winter fence goes up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his silver pocket watch, and pressed the latch. The case snapped open with that same sharp ping, 5 minutes to 9. Tell him the records are open, Marshal, Cassie said, her index finger anchoring herself deep into the worn oval groove in the dark oak wood. Every deed is signed, every name is logged, and there ain't a single page missing from the book. Reed Coltman looked down at her hand. Then he looked across the room at Arthur Thornton, who was showing Maeve how to sharpen her pencil with an old Barlow knife. The silent cowboy didn't say nothing. He just reached up, tilted his Stetson back an inch from his eyes, and turned his face toward the door to wait for the morning court to open. Cassie dipped her pen. The black ink glistened on the steel nib, ready for the first word. The frontier was still wide, and the limestone ridges were still cold. But inside the gray stone walls of Pale Fork, the paper was finally holding up the house. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
Not the gavel, not the gun, not the silver star pinned 2 inches above the pocket seam. The house of Pale Fork stood at the end because a woman in a plain charcoal dress sat down at an oak desk, pressed her hand into the groove her father had carved with 9 days of fear, and refused to let a single word go unrecorded. That is the whole architecture of this story, stripped to its load-bearing wall. Cassandra Thornton did not arrive in Pale Fork as a daughter on a mission of revenge. She arrived as a clerk, and in a county where the judge had spent 9 years deciding which words were permitted to exist. A clerk who wrote down the pauses, who logged the silences as carefully as the sentences, who marked the 3-second gap before a witness changed his answer, was the most structurally dangerous thing that Frontier had ever seen. This story is, at its core, about a question that sounds simple and turns out to be everything. Who gets to decide what the record says? Because the record is not just paper. The record is reality, as far as the law is concerned. Thaddeus Vance understood this with the cold, architectural patience of a man who had built his empire one razor-cut page at a time. He did not steal land with a rifle. He stole it with a deletion. He cut the name of the man who ordered a murder from the bottom of page 4, and in doing so, he did not merely conceal a crime. He unmade it. He turned a living, testifying human being into an administrative absence. And once a person is absent from the record, they have no deed, no rights, no history, and no voice before any court that reads that record as its map of the world. Vance didn't just silence Arthur Thornton. He erased the coordinates of every poor farmer and laboring hand in the valley, because a town whose clerk can be made to disappear is a town whose citizens can be made to disappear, one forged signature at a time. Against this, the story places not a hero with a fast draw, but a woman with an ink callus. Cassie's power is precision. It is the absolute refusal to let approximation stand in for truth. She writes the nouns and the verbs, and she writes what the nouns and the verbs are hiding. The gaze that slides to the judge before the answer comes. The sentence that breaks in the middle and lands somewhere safer. She understands, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who was raised by a man who believed in the sanctity of the transcript, that a court is only as honest as its record. When you control the definitions, you control the man standing in the box. When you narrow the permitted words, you narrow the permitted truth. And when the permitted truth is narrow enough, an innocent man hangs for the convenience of the county, and everyone in the gallery calls it justice, because the paper says so. But this story does not give us only the clarity of Cassie's pen. It gives us Reed Coltman, and in Reed Coltman, it gives us the most honest accounting this world of frontier fiction has ever offered, of the man who knew and did nothing.
Reed was not a villain. He was a deputy at 32 with new boots and the belief that the badge was a wall between the citizen and the wolf. He found out the wall had a gate, and the judge owned the key. And he stood on his porch and watched the dust rise and told himself he was being cautious. He used the language of the law, procedural verification, statutory foundation, secondary affidavit, as an elegant, lawyerly curtain to hang over a window that looked straight out onto his own cowardice. And the story names it without flinching. A law that only works when it is safe to enforce it is not law at all. It is an agreement among bullies. When you strip away the professional vocabulary, Reed Coltman and Thaddeus Vance did the same thing. They both decided they knew better than the truth what the peace required. One did it with a razor and a forged name. The other did it with a rocking chair and a hand on his iron that never moved. And then there is Arthur, the father in the stone cabin with the cracked spectacle lens and the rags on his feet, who had carried page 5 of the 1872 transcript against his skin for 3,000 days because he could not bear to be found. His choice, to become a ghost rather than let his daughter see the man who had folded his spectacles neatly and stepped onto the mule without a word, is the story's deepest wound and its most important lesson. He called it pride. He called it protection. He dressed his disappearance in the language of a gift. I am preserving your memory of me. But what he was actually preserving was himself from the unbearable sight of Cassie's face when she learned that the man who taught her the sanctity of the transcript had proven, at the critical moment, that a 20-year-old boy's hand on his elbow was stronger than everything he believed. He made his shame into her grief, and he called that mercy. Cassie names it the way she names everything. Precisely. Without heat, and without forgiveness. A secondary imprisonment. He locked the door from the inside and handed Reed the key, and both of them called it love, and neither of them asked her permission.